Hello, welcome back to our book series on the new UTOK book. We're going chapter by chapter throughout the book. This time we're going to do the garden, which is a super central element in UTOK. It actually houses most of the UTOK ideas, right? They're in the garden. And the garden itself as a whole has a whole symbolism to it, and it represents different things. So I'm excited to do this one.
Amen. It's great to be here. This will round out UTOK's three pillars.
Right.
When we talk about the pillars, we're talking about the epistemological frames of objective knowledge, framed by the natural science way of knowing. Then we did I-based knowledge, grounded in our human identity last time, the coin. This is we-based, second-person knowledge, whereby cultures get together, build systems of justification, and articulate what is and ought to be, and how to live in the world, and do so hopefully in a way that's effective and wise. At least that's the invitation from the garden.
Lovely. Yeah, and just to complete that, there was the it type of knowledge, right, with the TOK system that we did first. So I'll link all of those core pillars in the description so people can get acquainted with them. And I wanted to also throw back one more time to the book cover because we've talked about how it illustrates the core mantra in your talk. The core mantra is marry the coin to the tree in the garden under God. So it's the relationship between those epistemological vectors. And you can see that the garden takes up a lot of space here, right? There's the tree of life here in the center, the seed of life, the bees of wisdom. I got the stepping stone. So all of these elements make up the garden, and it's juxtaposed here super well with the coin, which is the epistemology of the subject, and the tree, which is the objective knowledge of men's knowledge, right? Modern empirical natural science. So again, this is what Christian did, and it was amazing, and it really illustrates that well. So we can start there.
Amen. I think it's a beautiful thing, and I love the way it captures the vectors. We're going to drop the I into the it, and then bind it to a we that's ultimately oriented toward wisdom and transcendence and goodness, truth, and beauty, and all of that. At least that's the vision.
Beautiful. All right, so let's dig into that. First, I think it would be nice for you to tell the little story briefly about how the garden came about. You talk once didn't have the garden at all, and that's kind of crazy to think back to. It was only, the ideas in the unified theory. The coin also came afterwards. So anyway, how did the garden come about? How was that constructed?
Totally. Well, the groundwork was laid because I had done the unified theory. That's up to 2011. In fact, next time we'll talk a little bit more about the evolution specifics. But just for the garden, I did the unified approach, had a TUA, these two kind of frameworks, and then was at a conference on beliefs and values. At the time, my friend Craig Shealy was really interested in beliefs and values and did a transdisciplinary conference called Cultivating the Globally Sustainable Self. And I'd like everybody to sort of think about that, think about where we are, okay, in terms of nation states, Mother Earth, and what is globally sustainable, okay, and how we should educate our children into our adolescents, into adults, and ourselves, and be guided by wise ways of thinking to the world, relating to each other. How do you cultivate that evolution? What is the proper holding environment, conceptual holding environment, value-based holding environment, understanding of where we are? And I went to a panel discussion, and these were brilliant people that had been flown in from all over the world. It's an international conference, and they're mostly educators, but also some psychologists and social sociologists, anthropologists, etc. And then the panel at the end was then like, we're going to summarize what we came together to discuss, cultivating the globally sustainable self, and what did we learn? And actually, I walked out of there with a lot of frustration because it was so, they couldn't wrap their head around the abstraction. As you zoom out and say, here I have, this is what transformational learning is to me in Africa, and this is what the educational structure is in China, and here we have, and then everybody like, what is the self, right? And what is globally sustainable, and how do, and it basically was just interesting people saying we don't really know. You know,
That's a
we
good parallel with what you experienced even with psychology, knowledge fragmentation in general,
just
right?
there's
Because you have to
no
bring coherence and unification to what you're trying to understand in a way that has integrity, that's not, just putting things together in a way that's undifferentiated, but That wasn't present. It was just fragmented, and people believed different things with no shared agreement.
Totally. And there's just there's no social truth that affords clarity about things like from physics to sociology to our rights values across culture. There just isn't. So you get an enlightenment gap, and then you get fragmentation. And psychology is fair to define terms like the self. And so we stumble in the dark. And then I was in the audience, and I basically was like, dude, as I walked out of there, I had built this Atua thing, and I was like, we should plant Atua seeds and grow Atua trees. That was the light bulb. That was a one sentence light bulb. I've had a couple of light bulbs. The Tree of Knowledge was a light bulb moment. And this was probably my second single, at least, and it didn't explode out of me. In fact, Lainey and I, my daughter, it was me, but with my daughter, over months then built the garden. 5-6 months took to actually kind of craft what would then be the final garden poster.
And then
But
just
that was the
clarify,
insight.
OTOA, that stands for Unified Theory, Unified Approach. So you had
Totally.
that framework, right? But it wasn't yet formed into the whole garden.
Exactly. And so actually now we could see we have our iQuad coin. On the flip side is the Tree of Life. Embedded in the Tree of Life is when you look at it, the left side of the Tree of Life, okay, is the 4 ideas that make up the Unified Theory, and embedded in that's a UT, and then there's 4 ideas that make up the Unified Approach, that's the UA, and that's actually in the tree, and it was called the Atua tree. And the idea was that it was a kindergarten that we could build that starts. My mom's a kindergarten teacher and a world award-winning, beautiful kindergarten teacher, and she knew how to create. And it was you'd have playgrounds, and what better place to have a nursery school than to have a garden, right? And then that's that many. So we would want a kinder garden where we would grow kids, and the idea was we could make them have contact with the world, the material world, the living world, the animal world, the human world, and the technological world. And then we'd have the world unfold for them in their life world relations in a place that actually bound knowledge together toward wisdom.
And each element of the garden will include that, will embody that principle, right? There is a very important principle to the garden that is to make up a scientific, humanistic worldview. And I'd say that that's present in each element, which is really cool. And we can start talking about the different things that compose the garden. But maybe the scientific, humanistic worldview is something to spend some time on.
Completely. So the idea is that the academy, as physics got a hold of the academy then created the Enlightenment gap. We used to have character education. It used to be dominated by Christianity, at least in the West, blah, blah, blah. And then it essentially fragments. And the biggest fragmentation is known as Snow's 2 cultures of the sciences on the one hand into physics and say literature, and the arts on the other, say Shakespeare or Picasso or any of the arts and the humanistic expression. And what he noticed is the professors in the humanities didn't know anything really about physics, and there was no way to bind physics to the humanities, and the academy had at least split between the humanities and the cultures. This is the 1950s. Arguably a third branch emerges with the social sciences because it doesn't really fit. And what I realized with the beauty of, and the reason that ultimately UTOK will emerge through psychology, is that psychology's structure, as UTOK identifies it, the basic psychology connects to the natural sciences. Human psychology connects to the social sciences to that effective bounding. And then the unified approach is nested right next to the humanities because it deals with subjects and well-being and values. And then
that's such a, yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt, but that's such a fortunate thing about you talking about the way you were positioned in the academic world within psychology, and the way that the problem of psychology, the problem of psychotherapy became so evident, because that was the entry point, right?
That was the entry point.
To actually find consilience in knowledge, because psychology precisely spans all those great domains of knowledge.
Completely. And it gives it the science side gives us methodology of the science, which, by the way, the language system is to factor out subjective quality, perspective, and moral value. The intersubjective is to give us the it perspective. That's what science is, but it can't do it ontologically because of the enlightenment gap problem of psychology. But so I get trained as a methodologist. I then see how to speak the it language and realize that behavior ism is the it language, but no one can get from behaviorism to mentalism effectively. And then UTOK solves that into human through justification. So now I can bind basic down all the way to physics into human, up to sociology. And then I'm a clinician, and you sit in the world, the life world of the patient. I say, you're the expert on you as a patient, right? Which I mean, I can honor the subject, and I have to deal with values. If you're going to kill yourself, do I call the police? Right? What are the values that we say is good? If you say I've got anxiety and I want to go rape somebody, help me cure my anxiety so I go rape somebody, I don't allow that because I know what values are. Science is silent on values. Science is more or less blind to subjectivity. And being a clinical psychologist forces you to that intersection, and the Enlightenment gap and problem of psychology. Right. So I just got vacuumed in.
Right. No, that's interesting. Again, that's a really good positioning. One term that we use, I don't know if we've used in the series yet, is the coincidence, right? Maybe last time in the IQUAD coin we did. But the coincidental, science is applied to the coincidental things that happen in our routine lives because those don't really matter at all to the objective conclusions of science. So being a scientist and a clinician sort of forces you to encounter both of those worlds and see that both of them are consequential and both of them matter in different domains.
Totally. And in fact, clinical psychology was playing out this battle. There were the empirical clinical psychologists, back to method, better method. That's clinical science. You have to be a scientist, method-based scientist, versus the PsyD, the doctor of psychology. No, running rats through mazes and having good internal validity on a scientific subject and everything about measurement and reliability, validity is totally different than working in the clinic.
Still echoes, right?
Totally. The system still never knew how, because there's too many variables, too much confusion. And unified means there actually is, we could take the best insights, weak versions of best insights, meaning, hey, you see something that's true. It is important. Method is important. Ontology, scientific naturalistic ontology is important. The subject is important. Values are important. Nobody actually disputes any of that. And ultimately, a conciliant position takes weak, obvious truths, binds them together and say there actually is a coherent articulation of weak, obvious truths. And that's the garden. The garden now created, not only does the argument, but the gestalt. Now all of a sudden you actually have an entire playground that is propositionally bound for a we space of is and ought that fills the gap and affords that chords the unity of natural science, social science, humanities, and the subject. And ultimately, the unity of the subject, of course, is I hadn't had the coin, but I then actually built the path to the coin, which then affords the unity of the unique particular subject. And then all of a sudden, that then is when you really just get an unbelievable binding. And so then you get full, pure articulation of we vectoring, I vectoring, it vectoring. What Wilbur was trying to see now can be seen.
Absolutely.
In a pure.
I wanted to zoom in. You were talking about the kindergarten idea of, these are the coherent unification of facts and values within the garden that we want to be able to transmit in an adaptive way, in an applied way to future generations. I think the seed, and I wanted to zoom in on the seed for that reason, because it really embodies all of that. The scientific humanistic worldview that the garden seeks, that I think that's really well illustrated here. So I wanted to bring that up. Do you want to talk a little bit about the educational infinity loop in the middle? And maybe the relationship with the wisdom energy icon. I know we're getting a little bit off script.
No, that's fine. I mean, we'll do a whole thing on the seed. Yeah, but especially in the context of scientific humanistic, you see the educational infinity loop says, hey, to start education, you start with language, and ultimately language is going to split. Language is going to get formalized in a particular way and go down into mathematics. Language is that's the enter. Language enters refined knowing. Okay?
Right.
That's what that symbolizes.
Loop is this the loop in the middle, and then all of these letters here represent these different domains.
Exactly.
Right?
So one is language itself, and then it splits. If you know how to interpret the architecture, it splits. It goes one humanistic direction, which is ultimately going to get into psychology and psychology, phenomenology. That's the P on the one direction, which is going to be part on the humanistic side. And the other one goes first to math to then formalize language in a quantify set categorical relation that can demonstrate deductive logic. And then you utilize the deductive logic architecture to create correspondence models with the world. That is natural science. So the S on the bottom is a correspondent theory of truth built off of the logic of mathematics that utilize the logic of mathematics to track the structural, functional, form relationships in the world that are reliable and valid from an it perspective. And that then creates the left-hand side is then the theoretical science, right, grounding right into natural science
And
worldview.
just before you continue, it's just really nice how that's a fractal of all the other relations in the garden. On the left side, if you go up, I'm not sure. Okay, so if you go up from the seed to the tree of life, you're going to have also that same division on the tree of life and that same kind of dialectic, the same kind of scientific humanistic give and take, right?
Absolutely. In fact, you can see the way the metaphysics of the periodic table of behavior was that's one flower down into the stepping stone, which was etched on there, the Born identity into the standard theory of elementary particle physics, which is the fundamental, at least decided upon, agreed upon, descriptive metaphysical understanding of the transition of energy fields into matter entities, the standard theory of elementary particle physics. And so that's just all of that then is then affording that's the vision and the balance, and we could see the sciences and the humanities, and now we can bind them in together into dialectics of the natural social sciences in relationship to subjects and values.
Yeah, and just on the other side, just to complete what we
right. So yeah, the P for
the
the subject, and ultimately I would now say really psychology, psychology helps frame then the subject, human subject, and then social studies, social science, SS. Okay, and then finally ethics, and it's the educational infinity loop. So social science, social studies is like how do we understand cultures and societies, human cultures and societies, both historically and scientifically, and then ethics is what are the values we use, how do we make decisions towards what's valuable.
And I love how the P, phenomenology or psychology, which is this new concept, right, that we're bringing. Maybe we can mention exactly what that is for people who don't know. But it also links up to things like the arts and the humanities, right, and those kinds of endeavors. And you could also make a connection here between PE and do physical education.
Right. So
And the idea that all of those domains are important to craft a truly Kantian worldview from the start, from the
right.
kindergarten. That's at least the dream.
That's right. And it binds together weak, good ideas. So in the current American curriculum, for example, there are 4 core areas of curriculum development. Like if you homeschool somebody, these are the curriculum for all schools nationally, essentially, unless you're a private school, you can get around with. But it's language, math, science, and social studies. So 4 of those entities are the foundation of all basic curriculum. So if we say, what do you learn in school? The 4 basic categories of knowing, and then there are other things like physical education, music, social skills. And what the seed says is actually there should be 6. We're underdeveloped on the humanistic side. We should teach you about your subjectivity, right? Your consciousness, like what phenomenology, your feelings. My kids went through, they basically didn't even learn what a feeling was. And we should learn about ethics, like what is good, what's a theory of ethics, right? And we should learn the social, historical, scientific, all of that. We should balance our science and humanities together. We don't do that. And we should frame the knowledge systems, then relationship into participatory art engagement. That's physical education would be one example of that. And then building things like how to be a gymnast or anyway, and then building the art expression. All of that would be sort of a third dimension on the seed that grows in the various ways. There's actually a whole other idea about how professional business ideas would be bound to that. The argument is that our propositional knowledge is what we're conferring educationally to our children, and the educational infinity loop divides that through the concept actually of justification. It's actually where it comes from, and current educational domains, and enables us to see how to round them out and bind the scientific humanistic infinity loop of a dialectic. There's always a dialectic. There's a Hegelian dialectic here between substance and subject, and the epistemic ontic, values and facts, and those things should all be bound together into a coherent descriptive metaphysical system, and the seed does that.
Lovely. I like that you mentioned the propositional transmission of that knowledge and dialectic. That brings me right to the meme flower. We could maybe just offer 5 minutes for that,
Totally.
or even less, to briefly touch on what it really does with, the small me which
Yep.
connects to the subject, connects to the individual worldview, and this big me, which is the large scale justification systems. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that. I'll try to find a picture of it.
Yeah, no, and we've got a meme representation, but right at the center of the the seed of life, tree of life, now shift over tree, is the meme flower, and this is the philosophical binding structure. Okay, the philosophical binding structure that right there's the zoomed in. We'll create a bigger picture for folks to see. It's the philosophical binding structure that UTOK uses to place the sciences and humanities together and symbolizes a dialectic in knowing between metaphysics and empiricism. What is empiricism? Empiricism is data into information through the senses on the one hand, and then systematically, scientifically, through a systematic observation, third person on the other. Actually, empirical then means these two words. It's data. Metaphysical
Right.
means the concept.
That's why we have a small and a big, right? So there's
Right. Well,
small.
then I'll get to that in 1 second. Right. So I'm referencing that. So then you have metaphysics, which are your concepts and categories, propositional, pre-empirical concepts and categories. Some people just call it logic, but actually, a descriptive metaphysical system is a better term than just logic, because you actually then say there's a whole mapping of concepts and categories and their dialectic, dichotomous, differential, dimensional relations. And then you can network that, and then you bind the concepts and categories with empirical findings. The argument is that human knowledge works that way. In fact, your person is your justificatory and propositional. And now we can look at you, and you would then say, well, actually, my system of justification are my language, concepts, and categories that I use to map the world. And my primate pulls in the empirical data and allows me, my I quad coin, to see the world first person. And therefore, my person primate is a small metaphysical empirical instance of a human identity function, my small me, which is kind of cool, right? My I, quad coin, is also corresponding to my small me, I-me relation, and it gives us, UTOK does this and binds together these synoptic concepts in weird conceptual synesthesia sort of ways.
We
My
talk about the
I,
I-me
quad,
relation, right?
I-me relation, like go back to William James. But anyway, so I'm a metaphysical, meaning I have concepts and categories, essentially my propositional language. It binds the world together empirically and vice versa, and there's a dialectic. And the big world views also have descriptive narratives about what is and ought through proposition, through with concepts and categories they bring to bear, a set of assumptions, Christianity, science, etc. And they pull in then empirical data, observations and facts around information to bind a justificatory large-scale worldview. The meme flower then says what we've got is a bunch of little individual me's that then can form a big me, and then it invites itself to the UTOK memeplex. So the memeplex is a belief value network that binds people together on the cultural person plane of existence, a large-scale system of justification, a network of replicable structures of empirical metaphysical entities that coordinate is and ought. And so this is a gateway then into the UTOK memeplex, the meme flower.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I think that puts things into motion in the garden. I was recently thinking about that because I was writing the garden blog. It's really not a static picture of different elements that can be described. It's really, you can definitely look at it as an ecosystem of things that relate to one another and build upon one another. There's a lot of affordance there for what you can do in the real applied world of your life as a subject in the world, embedded in collectives. So there really is
Totally.
a really coherent, really nice, effective, and efficient merger of what you do theoretically and what you do in your real life.
Love it.
That
So
garden prescribes.
the garden really is supposed to represent a dynamic ecosystem, and you could see this in terms. The stepping stone captures matter. Okay, then the seed is capturing the intergenerational transmission of knowledge. Right, and then the tree is both Mother Earth, ME. There's another ME reference. The tree of life's both Mother Earth and representing organisms as they live. And then the wisdom bees are dynamically relating to this as minded animals. We haven't talked about them, but they each represent aspects of wisdom, knowledge into wisdom. On the left-hand side, the Spia Sophia, and then there's Bia Phronesis. That represents applied wisdom and living wisely and oriented toward the adaptive living equation. So you have Sophia and Phronesis acting in the world. And then we relate to those modes of being, and then our subject gets beamed into and then invites us all to come together to create a memeplex to create a social truth in relationship to what we can all coherently agree on individually and collectively and scientifically. So then you have the person and society then pulled in, and this is all naturalistic, and of course, but it points to an emerging digital age with the fifth joint point. So then we're going to connect to the techno, especially the artificial interface that's coming, that's implied in the fifth joint point of the tree of knowledge. And now we can then say, here is our naturalistic, humanistic, scientific, humanistic way of being naturally in the world in a way that clarifies what is, cultivates what ought to be, and sets us up to then be positioned to travel through the fifth joint point as we start to interface with artificial intelligence systems that we've created.
Lovely. Yeah, that's why the garden is prescriptive, right? In that way, it is descriptive also, because it does connect to the TOK, it does connect to natural science, but it gives the odd dimension to the marriage that it does, with the coin of the tree under God. So
right, and it's under the concept of God. That was added. The original garden, really, God sits above the garden. You can certainly depiction, but the concept of God is what allows you to binds you towards well-being and wisdom. And ultimately, concept of God was how do we transcend our egos, our perspective, and be both good descendants historically into good ancestors future. And in the UTOKs, very much good answers, because it's saying we got the fifth joint point and things happening. and it can go one way or another.
Dynamic, right? And
we need something that's dynamic.
Something that can be done in the real. I was looking for this picture here because I think it illustrates it.
Right, that was the other.
Talks about what the bees does, in the tree of life on both sides of science and humanism. And the idea is to maintain that dialectic.
That's right.
Dynamically in the garden.
So what that means is we want to be able to situate our lives, and this is a nod to Alexander Bard, who talks about narratology. There's a constant dialectic between our mythos, that's our we space, justifying story about what is, how do we do that, logos, what science can do, and our pathos, which is embedded in our feeling in the real world. We don't have a system that binds that together with any degree of coherence. There's no constraining structure that coordinates them in right relation. And that's what the rotation says, hey, I'm going to take my subjective and valued structure, connect with people, and then wonder about science, or I'm going to take science, but also in the service of well-being and human flourishing and the dynamism of the vortex, and the way in which the yin-yang symbol is captured in the me flower allows, or at least pulls, that kind of dynamism.
Mm-hmm. Lovely. To wrap it up, I'm glad that you mentioned the rhetoric categories, because let's talk about the mythos aspect. That's, all over this book in a way, because it's that aspect of UTOK that was not explored, at least officially, previously. And the garden really does that, and it's crazy how it just really ties all that mythos to the scientific picture that UTOK gives through the TOK, which is maybe the most famous part of UTOK, but the garden complements that super nicely. So let's talk about the mythos aspect. There's some relations with even the Christian origin myth, and I think that's a very cool aspect of it.
Well, absolutely. So it's embedded, of course, in the Western Judeo-Christian. So there's a tree of knowledge and a tree of life, and they're both sort of the same tree, but also different. One's a horizontal tree that then speaks to how we discern what truth, but be careful with that. How we eat off of that might cause us realizations and ultimately banish us from God. That's, of course, the myth. And then it returns us to, we can return to eating off the tree of life with a proper understanding of ourselves in relationship to the tree of knowledge. So it's got this Eden mythos, but it's a protopian, realistic, adaptive, not some utopian types of stuff. And I'll just say, I've been thinking more about this lately. The book ends with a remarkable singularity. And we can come back to that in the fifth joint point. And the idea, there's actually some empirical evidence that like 2028 is an important thing. And there's this idea of complexification reaching a vertical limit function at 2028, which is weird and cool. And that's a mythos at some level, but it's also really empirical. The nice thing about UTOK is it's binding these things together. And I will say, hey, what are we doing after Trump? I'll just throw that out there. What is our story for ourselves, our future story? Mythos is what binds the future. Science about what is back into the past, and it can make predictions, but it can't tell you. But what do we want our future to be collectively? That's that's the domain of mythos.
That's a nice frame. I like that. Yeah.
And what is, because it's the is into ought that orients us towards what is good. Yeah, so I ask us all, what is your post-Trump mythos, right? And actually 2028, then this is a, how do we bind our social truths together in a post-Trump world? What are we doing? Right? And so the garden then would invite us to say, how do we look at this in an adaptive way? And then what are the facts values that actually can transcend history, in real conservative ways, can transcend history, ground us, and then orient us towards wise adaptive outcomes across a cognitive light cone that then really extends you in time and scope.
Lovely. Yes, back to an adaptive conservative, right?
An adaptive conservative, right? Not a completely actually destroy all institutions.
That's beautiful. And just one last thing, those meta values that guide the garden, they are actually present in the seed of life. We didn't talk about that, but there's the wisdom energy icon. And
that, yeah.
It has inscribed in the meta values of UTOK, which are dignity, well-being, and integrity, in a way that's aligned with beauty, truth, and goodness, which are the transcendentals. Right. So that's already inscribed in there. And what better guiding structure do you want?
Right. I mean, we think about the weak, good truth of all those things, right? It's like, hey, it doesn't like try to prescribe like this that you have to do. Ethics actually about doing that toward adaptive living, but it says, what are we guiding toward? Goodness, truth, and beauty, dignity, well-being, integrity. Those are pretty good
it's very
concepts, and like I said, now we're destroying, in maybe some good ways, an older system. What's going to come after it? What's our mythos for that? UTOK's Garden really fundamentally is an invitation for a mythos to bind our pathos and logos together toward an ethos.
Beautiful. All right, I'm very happy with that. Next time we're gonna go through the whole history of the whole system. That's gonna be fun to do, a little storytelling on your end about how this all came about.
Amen. Thanks so much. It's lovely to be on this journey with you, my dear.
Yes, it is.